hot, very humid, high heat index. But you know what? We realized is even with all this heat, COVID-19 is not going away, right? So as you may remember, since we're doing the back to school COVID-19 special, there was some thought back in the spring that maybe with the higher heat, the humidity, transmission may not be as robust. And clearly, with about, in Florida, just under 9,000 cases every day. We have hot spots literally and figuratively going on. So that hypothesis seems to have been disproven.
So why don't we get into that? Let's talk about schools and COVID-19. And since you are our resident infectious disease and baby daddy
baby.
extraordinaire, of how many you got going that you know about? This is a this is a
What I
break
know
point for
about
an
that is
edit point.
confirmed is one only. So I'm not, wasn't as busy as we might have thought.
So our lovely friend Donald Trump said we must return back to school. If not, he'll cut funding. And to me, that sounds so eerily familiar, like the economy and opening up restaurants and bars and stuff like that. And now we see what happens with that, right? So we've got record-breaking cases in Florida, California. We've outlawed indoor dining. So what makes us all so sure that we'll be able to go back to school? So what's your take? What's your hot take?
Well, it's not a soundbite, right? It's a whole discussion. That's why we're doing a whole podcast today to discuss back to school issues, pros, cons, and everything in between. Because as everything in life, there's never black and white. It's a lot of gray, right? So we start out broadly is that we can't, just like we politicize wearing a mask, we politicize, opening up the economy. We cannot politicize our children's health and going back to school. We really, and I've said it from the get-go, we said from the get-go, let's just believe science. Let's look what the science has showed us, right? So
Well, let's start off saying we all agree going back to school is important,
absolutely. So look,
right?
no one is going to say that I think we should do another year of Zoom calls and Skype and what have you, right? So it's been very uneven in terms of how different kids respond, right? A second grader has a difficult time paying attention. My fifth grader this past year, would do work better than a second grader, but still, it's not natural. For a couple of months, maybe they make it work. We fill in the gaps. But there's a whole host of issues going forward. Social issues with kids, assuming that there's always going to be a parent at home, right? They can take care of the kid. You know what? You take a step back. You assume that everyone's got a high-speed internet and a Chromebook or a laptop for the kid to use.
Right.
That's kind of a large assumption. I mean, there have been studies showing that in inner cities, let's say Patterson, Camden, Newark, something like 60% of the kids don't have access at home to high-speed internet, a laptop, a Chromebook, a desktop, what have you. So that's a big assumption. And what about parents that have to go to work? What do they do for daycare? Right. So this conversation is wrought with all kinds of issues.
Right.
But I think today we should just focus on strictly the science. So we're gonna take a step back from the socio-economic kind of issues. What is the science telling us about going back to school? So
So let me ask you, what are the risks are going back to school for so it's not only the kids, right? It's the teachers, the parents, the grandparents. So there was some evidence that children below a certain age have low transmission rates or transmissibility.
admissibility, right? So that's not necessarily the case. We know this virus in general, SARS-CoV-2, is a very efficient agent in transmitting from person to person, right? Dr. Fauci said it all the way down the line, all the way down the line. So, and this is proven it's fact. And we were very wrong in the beginning to assume that those are asymptomatic, less likely to transmit, and that it must be those who are actually symptomatic that would be much more likely to transmit.
Right.
We now know that across the board, pre-symptomatic, before you get sick, and asymptomatic are very efficient viral shedders. And when they shed the virus, even if they have no symptoms, they can still infect other people, right? And so I can tell you personally, we've seen cases already in our own practice, in our own area, of adults being infected and by contact tracing going back to an asymptomatic child. So this is a very real issue that people are already keenly worried about. They're aware about, they're worried about, et cetera. But this is something that is not unfounded. It is very much founded in our data that we've seen so far. So that's first and foremost. But we also want our kids to go back to school. We want them to learn. We don't want them to fall behind. We also know that this whole COVID experience has been very uneven. We have hot spots. New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, tri-state was a hot spot. Now we're one of the few states in New Jersey that continues to go down in case rates, hospitalizations, et cetera. So, it's hard to make a one fit approach for the entire country. So I think really each
Well,
locale.
oh, wait. But
Uh-oh.
on that point, like, I think the problem is that with all these hotspots, there's just a lack of uniformity, right? There's no guidance. If you listen to Betsy DeVos and Donald Trump, even the CDC's recommendations on going back to school, it's so generic and broad that I don't think it leaves it up to the discretion of the school boards and the principals and stuff like that. So I think it may be safe for one particular school, but there may be outbreaks in other schools. So I don't think it's the way to do it. It has to be some kind of uniform policy.
Well, listen, I mean, these policies, this has been the experience from the get-go, and
Right,
we're not towing the line of any politics, right? We're talking science, but even in the beginning, back in March, there was, it was really individual areas, even including our own hospital, medical center, Holy Name Medical Center. We had to develop our own strategies, our own protocols. There was a lack of central leadership, certainly from the get-go, and that has now somewhat been fine-tuned, but it's still very area dependent upon what plans and protocols go into place. So I think there's a lot of moving parts that people have to look at, as well as local policymakers, educators, et cetera. But so what are they looking at? They're looking at what is the daily case count, right? So new cases, the
right.
percentage of cases going positive, and then hospitalizations, death rates. A lot of different statistics people have to look at. The problem is what's happening now in July. What is it? July 24th, 27th. It's hard to predict what's going to happen and what the situation will be. Let's just say right around Labor Day in September.
What
Um,
about, so as of today,
but the
how would
problem
you
is they have to
envision
plan
going back to
today
school?
for September, so they have to take the data from today. So my point is, even though we're a relative safe zone, if you look at a map, a heat map, we're a green area, not a yellow, not a red.
Right,
That very well may change by September. So I think when we talk broadly, we can talk specifically. Any parent, anyone listening out there has to understand that whatever we're saying today could be outdated by September, and any plan that may be put in place now will most likely have to be revisited and refined going forward. And we have to be willing to always put the brakes and even hit reverse, right? With any plan that goes into play. But as of right now, the idea is that we know that transmissibility is related to density, so how close the kids are together,
right,
and it's related to other factors like not wearing a mask or wearing a mask. Obviously, it's much more transmissible and efficacious to transmit indoors and outdoors. We
right,
live in New Jersey, so we can't have outdoor schools. So they're trying to decrease the density. If you look at the equation, what can they control? They can control the density and they control mask wearing, at least in theory.
right.
That's where it gets hazy. You can maybe control kids wearing masks in fifth and sixth grade and onward. I would be hard pressed to find any parent that really believes their kindergarten, their first grader, their second grader will be compliant with wearing a mask at all times, right? So
Right.
this is where it gets hazy. And I think the biggest part of this is decreasing the density. And that's what it comes down to. Decreasing orbit. So every other day, AM, PM, these are conversations that, and pros and cons with everything, which we can discuss. And at the end of the day, there is no definitive answer because this is really uncharted territory. But if you decrease the density, it becomes much more natural for kids to have less interaction, more natural to have that 6 foot barrier. Because let's be honest, as humans, we're used to getting together. It's hard to tell a kid stay 6 foot away from your other friend
Right.
because it's human nature to get together. So the easiest way to at least facilitate that is decrease the density. And that, is what most schools are looking at. AM, PM, odd and even, decrease putting kids in different categories and trying to limit the density. Now, of course, that's wrought with all kinds of problems because
Right.
public schools, a lot of public schools are working with limited funds, right? So how do you do that? What do you do with the kids every other day? Is it live learning or is it just log in on a computer and
Right.
check a box? I did this, I did this, I did this. What about parents who have to work? What do you do about daycare? So the kids that go to daycare, they're now with other kids. Does that defeat the purpose if they come back the next day to school? So you can see there's a lot of issues here. So I think,
And I guess another issue is what happens if, someone gets sick? Do you quarantine the whole school? Is there enough testing to do contact tracing, right? So the kid who's sick in the class, does the whole
well,
class get tested? Does the teacher get tested? The parents get tested? All that stuff has to be worked out. And as we stand now, as far as getting tested,
right.
we're pretty limited, and try to do that
Well, we're
in a
certainly
school
better than
system.
we were before. We need faster turnaround time. So you have these answers very quickly, right? Because we know that kids can be, anyone can be can transmit the virus and they're pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic. So just because of the fact you don't have a temperature does not mean that a child cannot potentially transmit to somebody else.
Of course.
Now, short of testing everyone every day for the virus, which is not reasonable and not practical, we have to ensure then decreased population density, compliance with masks, and compliance with hand hygiene. With the understanding, at the end of the day, this is not a perfect scenario. There's still going to be, I think, guaranteed a transmission during school.
Right.
It's already happening with sports, right? I mean, there've been outbreaks in the MLB, there's been outbreaks in Rutgers, there've been outbreaks in Ridgewood, all linked to contact sports.
Okay, you mentioned sports. I think what would work in this ideal situation is what the NBA is doing with the bubble, right? So you send your kids off to school for, 2 months. You don't get to see them. They get tested every day. They don't leave, and they get their education, and you could
You know
FaceTime.
what? That's right. I
I'm
mean,
going to propose
that
that.
may work for the NBA. That's not going to work for school.
No,
Obviously. No, but it's a
LeBron
good
James
thought.
Jr.
It's definitely a good thought. It's definitely a good thought. I think what is it? Is it the Yankees game against the Phillies has now been canceled because the Phillies played the Marlins. The Marlins have several positive cases. So that's just a harbinger, I think, of what can happen at the high school and middle school and elementary level, right? So
School sports are important too. Are we canceling
now
those too?
let me preface it by saying I understand when parents say sports is important. After school activities is important. They're all important. It's true. So then we have to understand what is the risk we're willing to take. Because
Right.
it is true, if we take a step back, that most kids will be asymptomatic or have very mild disease and be fine. Fine, at least in the short setting, in the short term. Do we know the long-term ramifications of having COVID-19? No, we don't, right? The short term, yes, they're going to be okay. For the vast overwhelming majority. But what if they come home, they give it to their parents? Parents are okay. Parents go visit the grandparents. Are we okay with that?
Right.
Are we assuming that we don't know, teachers have all different age groups, elementary schools, oftentimes teachers may be younger. You have the whole age gamut, right, of teachers. Certainly by just percentage chance, you're going to have teacher underlying conditions that may make them more susceptible to serious complications of COVID.
Right.
What happens to them? So these are all kinds of issues that I think I certainly understand and I feel for. So when we say we must get our kids back at all costs, I mean, that is a foolish statement without understanding the whole ramifications and understanding the limitations, even with decreasing density, even with testing for temperature, there inevitably is going to be a transmission from child to child. That's just a reality.
Right. So you mentioned transmission from child to child, but we don't focus on those instances where kids actually got sick, that Kawasaki-like syndrome. And to me, as a parent, that's pretty scary. Can you tell us more about that? Or you have any insight about that?
Kawasaki is a multi-system, so meaning affects the whole body, inflammatory disease. They actually have their own separate entity now for COVID. Is it very common? No. People should understand that. You always want to separate fact from fiction. It's something people should be aware of. This is not something that every child out there is getting, even a majority, even a minority. It's a very small percentage. If you look at Kawasaki's disease and then the incidence associated with COVID-19, there's a slight significant increase. It's still very, very low. Now, this disease has been around for 6 months. So do we as scientists, as physicians know the long-term ramifications, especially in kids who are still developing, whose central nervous system is still developing? No. So there are still some unknowns. So for those out there that say, well, my kid will get it and no big deal, I mean, I cannot tell you as a physician, you cannot tell, no one can say as a physician, there's no long-term sequelae in terms of brain development, in terms of other issues that may come down the road. So I think people shouldn't be so cavalier to say, let my kid get it. They'll be fine. They'll be immune going forward.
Right.
We know that COVID-19 has a special affliction, a special predilection, I should say, for the brain, the CNS. So there's always been at least a theoretical concern in children whose brains are still developing up to the age of 18. How does that affect the brain development? Are there long-term ramifications, sequelae, long-term effects? And that is still an unknown. So people should be aware of that, certainly.
So to me, and I want to get your opinion, it sounds like there's too many loose ends and too many variables and too many questions out there. I would vote as a parent and as a physician to homeschool until we have a better idea of what's going on.
We were going to avoid the socioeconomic issues, but that is making a lot of assumptions. That we have to understand. Remember, especially in city settings, A lot of kids depend upon schools for free lunch.
Right.
They depend up, working parents that may not afford daycare. They assume that, hey, my kid will be at school from 9 to 3, 9 to 2, and I work during that time. Just saying homeschool, I think we should have options,
So what
certainly.
do you, all right, so give me your ideal situation.
Listen, my ideal situation may be different than yours, maybe different than everyone else. I think, someone very, very much more astute and elegant than me had said that my
No,
COVID
you're
experience,
pretty astute. You're pretty astute.
I'm not bad.
You're
Remember,
astute.
English is
Less
my
less
first language.
eloquent, but more astute. If
Yeah,
you
I mean,
were to be an advisor to our president of the United States, what would you recommend as far as school opening?
I
Oh,
think
never
we need
mind
to
the
have
president. Never mind your local board of education.
look. I think we need to have multiple options available, options that are flexible, that can evolve as the data evolves. We should let all the plans be not ruled by economics, not ruled by politics, but by data. And data, especially in COVID-19, this pandemic is evolving in real time. So as things change, we have to be able to adjust and change. You have to see hard interventions. If by opening schools, you see the new cases remaining relatively flat, you see the positivity rate not increasing, right? So we're following science here, not what's happening in the politics in October, November, et cetera. Then we say, okay, we'll hold the course.
Right.
If we see by using hard data that no, the positivity rate's increasing, daily hospitalizations is increasing, so there must be secondary transmission from child to child and child to an adult, and someone who may more likely have severe disease. We need to say, hey, we may need to put the brakes in this. We may need to reverse. We
Right.
started some contact sports. We may need to say, no, this is not the right thing. So we need to have constant vigilance, surveillance, and testing.
But my challenging question to you is how do we do that? How do we get data if we can't collect data and get data in a reasonable time? I agree
Well,
with you. If
I
we were
feel
able to if we were to have data and reliable testing in an appropriate amount of time, then that would all make sense. But if it takes a week to get results back, you can't contract. It's hard to contact trace someone who's been exposed a week later to other people.
the Health and Human Secretary, Alex Azar, who, by the way, is from my hometown and whose father was my
West
ophthalmologist growing up
Side,
and
yeah.
a good friend of my father. Huh?
West Side,
Salisbury, Maryland. That's it right there. So he's a son of Salisbury, as they say. He was very vocal in the news this morning and yesterday saying we need more rapid testing with 24-hour turnaround. That's true.
yeah.
Because when you have that quick turnaround, you can make, which is accurate and sensitive and specific, we can be much more proactive about making decisions. Is someone positive, someone negative? Okay, if they're positive, very quickly assess who do they come in contact with. Not wait
Right.
several days, right? The more days that go on, the more hours that go on, the more time someone has contact with someone else, or some contact with someone else. And we can talk about contact tracing all day, but it's not easy. It's not
Right.
easy. New York City, for instance, has a contact tracing core. But I'll tell you a perfect example. I saw someone last week, a patient, a mother and a son, who came back to the tri-state area from Florida, a hot zone, both positive. Well, they stopped at 2 or 3 rest stops and 2 restaurants between here and Florida
Yeah.
over a 3-day period. Now, up and down 95. How feasible is it that you're going to contact every single one person that stopped at those, all those rest stops, restaurants,
Yeah.
etc.? It's not feasible. So, so we need to get the levels down in new cases where we can easily do contact tracing.
Right.
When we're having cases exploding in Florida, Arizona, South Carolina, Texas, we're nowhere near, the levels where we need, maybe here in New Jersey for now. But if that changes, then we need to be able to, again, have those hard stops. So when you talk about testing, you're very much right. It's really not just the amount of testing, but
Can you
the
say that again?
accuracy. Huh?
Can you say that
Oh,
again?
you are right. Rare, one of these
What?
rare instances where you are right. That's right.
You couldn't say you were right. You just throw in a rare.
I had,
You're
it
such a
comes naturally, and
jackass.
I apologize, but I always feel like I have to preface it,
Apology accepted.
put you down somehow, and that's really not right. So I apologize.
All right.
It's that quick turnaround time is what we need. We've come a long way from March and April, where I would wait a week, 10 days for a patient, have to make some phone calls, get approval by the state. State has to get repeat the test down to CDC. That was our hands tied behind our back. Our hands are free now, but we still need to move faster and faster for sure.
And then what happens? There's so many questions I have. What happens if we're in New Jersey and then we go on vacation, or can we not go on vacation to a hot spot and come back to school? It's like, do we have to quarantine? There's so many different questions. Like, Some employers require that their employees quarantine for a certain amount of time before coming back to work. We know
And
in the
maybe,
hospital we have to quarantine for, I think, almost a week before we actually go back to work. Does that apply to schools as well?
I mean, I think in New Jersey, look, there are the certain red states, red zones, hot zones, whatever you want to call it, that you're required to check in and quarantine.
Right.
Who's enforcing that, right? I mean, that someone may say, I came back from South Carolina, I came back from Texas. Are they really reporting in,
Yeah.
are they telling anybody? If they're just driving in, if you're flying in, fine. If you're driving in, are they really using Easy Pass to track people? That has been a question that's eluded me as well. Is how compliant have we been with tracking and with enforcing these quarantine rules? I think with schools, it's going to be tough. Spring break comes along, if someone chooses to send their kid to go take a family trip to Florida, and Florida's a hot spot,
Yeah.
and warn ahead of time, I think, yes, they're obligated to quarantine for X amount of time, or at least test within. Now we know that most people, the most infective period is the first 10 days, either when they're asymptomatic but still positive, or pre-symptomatic. That time is before they show symptoms. So is it really 2 weeks? It might be 10 days. We can use testing along that time. If by 10 days you haven't tested positive, I would say the vast majority of people then can be considered clear.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, these are things we're going to have to answer going forward.
So I think what I took from here is that it's a complicated issue, right? So kids are at risk. They can transmit the disease. So we have to have a very secure plan that includes, appropriate turnaround time for testing in order for me as a parent to feel safe. I'm sure, and you as well, to feel
Right.
safer to bring our kids back to school. You got any closing remarks? Right? I don't,
No, I will
my
tell you,
mind is
but
racing.
I know, but it's a lot going on. But just I'll bring it back, to because we're trying to also be cognizant of social and economic and racial and all the equalities within healthcare. I mean, I think some people tell me, hey, I should just homeschool, right? Okay, I'll stay at home. Again, it still shows you that that's a possibility for some people, not for others. So I think, from the get-go, this virus has exposed and exploited differences in people's socioeconomic status. And that's not just the United States, that's around the world.
Yeah.
And I think going back to school the same way, there's some people who may say, I've had friends tell me I'm going to send my kid to private school. You know why? Because private schools, by definition, have 10 kids per class. They have more resources. They might be a bigger campus, than a public school in an inner city or suburban setting. Easier to social distance. Public schools are governed by labor laws and labor unions, including teachers unions. Private schools, they might say, well, teachers can have to do whatever we tell them to do. So I see a lot. I think this is going to be just another example of that disparity. Yeah. I'm hoping as policymakers that they will look at physicians and scientists and say, let's just focus on the science and the data, so we can make every single person across the board, whatever choice they may choose, private school, public school, magnet school, at home, part-time at home, homeschool, whatever it might be, that everyone has a chance to go to school, everyone has a chance to learn, to be educated, and they can make, at the end of the day, it's going to be, a lot of it's making the best decision that every family has to make for themselves. But right. We need to ensure those policies are in place that we can give them the best chance to make those decisions. Now, how do you like that for a conclusion?
Well said. Well said. Real question is, what would Ja Rule do? Do you know about that?
Wasn't he big when I was in med school, late 90s?
This is not going to turn into a Ja Rule conversation. I just made a joke.
I'm trying to think of that song. I can hear it in the back of my head. It's like holla, holla, that one, right?
Oh God! All right, never mind.
He's got the real growly voice. You know what? You like to expose my lack of hip hop knowledge, although I'm very knowledgeable, like 80s, 90s, ghetto boys, Fat Boys, Beat Street, all that.
I think you should stop while your a certain level of cool is maintained.
Oh my goodness! All right,
well, anyway,
we're gonna talk about metal next time and see what you know.
All right. Well, stay tuned to further episodes regarding COVID-19 and school and going back to school and all that stuff.
I think we're gonna have multiple conversations about it. Yes. So I think we should. It's time.
Please subscribe. I think the link should be below. And we'll see you next time.